This is going to be part 2 of the audio recording of the history of the Waldenses by the Reverend J.A. Wylie, copyright 1860. I'm having to do these in 40-minute segments because the program I'm using only allows me to do something up to that size, and I'm not techie, so I don't know of a program that would help me do something where it's all in one piece, so I apologize for that. All right, just for my own benefit, I'm on page 31 in my copy. The century, the opening of which had been so fearfully marked, passed on amid continuous executions of the Waldenses. In the absence of such catastrophes as that of Christmas, 1400, individual Vaudois were kidnapped by the inquisitors, ever on the track for them, or waylaid whenever they ventured down into the plains of Piedmont, and were carried to Turin and other towns, and burned alive. But Rome saw that she was making no progress in the extermination of a heresy which had found a seat amid these hills, as firm as it was ancient. The numbers of the Waldenses were not thinned, their constancy was not shaken. They still refused to enter the Roman Church, and they met all the edicts and inquisitors, all the torturings and burnings of their great persecutor, with a resistance as unyielding as that offered by their rocks to the tempests of hail and snow which the whirlwinds of winter hurled against them. It was the year 1487. A great blow was meditated. The process of purging the valleys languished. Pope Innocent VIII, who then filled the papal chair, remembered how his renowned namesake, Innocent III, by an act of summary vengeance, had swept the Albigensian heresy from the south of France. Imitating the vigor of his predecessor, he would purge the valleys as effectually and as speedily as Innocent III had done the plains of Dauphine and Provence. The first step of the Pope was to issue a bull denouncing as heretical those whom he delivered over to slaughter. This bull, after the manner of all such documents, was expressed in terms of sanctimonious as its spirit was inexorably cruel. It brings no charge against those men as lawless, idle, dishonest, or disorderly. Their fault was that they did not worship as Innocent worshipped, and that they practiced a simulated sanctity, which had the effect of seducing the sheep to the true fold. Therefore he orders, quote, that malicious and abominable sect of malignants, if they, quote, refuse to abjure, to be crushed like venomous snakes. To carry out his bull, Innocent VIII appointed Albert Cataneo, Archdeacon of Cremona, his legate, entrusting to him the chief conduct of the enterprise. He fortified him, moreover, with papal missives to all princes, dukes, and powers, within whose dominions any Vaudois were to be found. The Pope especially accredited him to Charles VIII of France and Charles II of Savoy, commanding them to support him with the whole power of their arms. The bull invited all Catholics to take up the cross against the heretics, and to stimulate them in this pious work, it, quote, absolved from all ecclesiastical pains and penalties, general and particular. It released all who joined the crusade from any oaths they might have taken. It legitimized their title to any property they might have illegally acquired, and promised remission of all their sins to such as should kill any heretic. It annulled all contracts made in favor of Vaudois, ordered their domestics to abandon them, forbade all persons to give them any aid whatever, and empowered all persons to take possession of their property. These were powerful incentives, plenary pardon and unrestrained license. They were hardly needed to awaken the zeal of the neighboring populations, always too ready to show their devotion to Rome by spilling the blood and making a booty of the goods of the Waldenses. The King of France and the Duke of Savoy lent a willing ear to the summons from the Vatican. They made haste to unfurl their banners and enlist soldiers in this holy cause. And soon a numerous army was on its march to sweep from the mountains where they had dwelt from immemorial time. These confessors of the gospel faith, pure and undefiled. In the train of this armed host came a motley crowd of volunteers, vagabond adventurers, says Muston, ambitious fanatics, reckless pillagers, merciless assassins, assembled from all parts of Italy. A horde of brigands, in short, the worthy tools of the man whose bloody work they were assembled to do. Before all these arrangements were finished, it was the month of June of 1488. The Pope's bull was talked of in all countries, and the din of preparation rang far and near, for it was not only on the Waldensian mountains, but on the Waldensian race, wherever dispersed, in Germany, in Calabria, and in other countries, that this terrible blow was to fall. All kings were invited to gird on the sword, and come to the help of the Church in the execution of her purpose of effecting an extermination of her enemies that should never need to be repeated. Wherever a Vaudois foot trod, the soil was polluted and had to be cleansed. Wherever Vaudois breathed, the air was tainted and must be purified. Wherever Vaudois psalm or prayer ascended, there was the infection of heresy, and around the spot a cordon must be drawn to protect the spiritual health of the district. The Pope's bull was thus very universal in its application, and almost the only people left ignorant of the commotion it had excited, and the bustle of preparation it had called forth, were those poor men on whom this terrible tempest was about to burst. The joint army numbered about 18,000 regular soldiers. This force was swelled by thousands of ruffians, already mentioned, drawn together by the spiritual and temporal rewards to be earned in this work of combined piety and pillage. The Piedmontese division of this host directed their course toward the valleys proper, on the Italian side of the Alps. The French division, marching from the north, advanced to attack the inhabitants of the Dolphinese Alps, where the Albigensian heresy, recovering somewhat its terrible excision by Innocent III, had begun again to take root. Two storms from opposite points, or rather from all points, were approaching those mighty mountains, the sanctuary and citadel of the primitive faith. That lamp is about to be extinguished at last, which has burned here during so many ages, and survived so many tempests. The mailed hand of the Pope is uplifted, and we wait to see the blow fall. Chapter 4. Cataneo's expedition against the Dolphinese and Piedmontese confessors. We see at this moment two armies on the march to attack the Christians inhabiting the Cottian and Dolphinese Alps. The sword now unsheathed is to be returned to its scabbard only when there breathes no longer in these mountains a single confessor of the faith condemned in the bull of Innocent VIII. The plan of the campaign was to attack at the same time on two opposite points of the great mountain chain, and advancing, the one army from the southeast and the other from the northwest, to meet in the valley of the Agrojna, not sure how to pronounce that, the center of the territory, and there strike the final blow. Let us first follow the French division of this host, that which is advancing against the Alps of Dauphine. This portion of the Crusaders was led by a daring and cruel man skilled in such adventures, the Lord of La Palud. He ascended the mountains with his fanatics and entered the Vale of Lois, a deep gorge overhung by towering mountains. The inhabitants, seeing an armed force 20 times their own number enter their valley, despaired of being able to resist them and prepared for flight. They placed their old people and children in rustic carts, together with their domestic utensils, and such store of victuals as the urgency of the occasion permitted them to collect, and, driving their herds before them, they began to climb the rugged slopes of Mount Pelvoux, which rises some 6,000 feet over the level of the valley. They sang canticles as they climbed the steeps, which served at once to smooth their rugged path and to dispel their terrors. Not a few were overtaken and slaughtered, and theirs was, perhaps, the happier lot. About halfway up there is an immense cavern called Aiguë Froide, it's Aiguë-Froid, from the cold springs that gush out from its rocky walls. In front of the cavern is a platform of rock, where the spectator sees beneath him only fearful precipices, which must be clambered over before one can reach the entrance to the grotto. The roof of the cave forms a magnificent arch which gradually subsides and contracts into a narrow passage or throat, and then widens once more and forms a roomy hall of irregular form. Into this grotto, as into an impregnable castle, did the Vaudois enter. Their women, infants, and old men they placed in the inner hall. Their cattle and sheep they distributed along the lateral cavities of the grotto. The able-bodied men posted themselves at the entrance. Having barricaded with huge stones both the doorway of the cave and the path that led to it, they deemed themselves secure. They had provisions to last, Cataneo says in his Memoirs, for 2 years, and it would cost them little effort to hurl headlong down the precipices anyone who should attempt to scale them in order to reach the entrance of the cavern. But a device of their pursuer rendered all the precautions and defenses vain. La Palud ascended the mountain on the other side, and approaching the cave from above, let down his soldiers by ropes from the precipice overhanging the entrance to the grotto. The platform in front was thus secured by his soldiers. The Vaudois might have cut the ropes and dispatched their foes as they were being lowered one by one, but the boldness of the maneuver would seem to have paralyzed them. They retreated into the cavern to find in it their grave. La Palud saw the danger of permitting his men to follow them into the depths of their hiding place. He adopted the easier and safer method of piling up at its entrance all the wood he could collect, and setting fire to it. A huge volume of black smoke began to roll into the cave, leaving to the unhappy inmates the miserable alternative of rushing out and falling by the sword that waited for them, or of remaining in the interior to be stifled by the murky vapor. Some rushed out and were massacred, but the greater part remained till death slowly approached them by suffocation. Quote, "When the cavern was afterward examined," says Muston, "there were found in it 400 infants, suffocated in their cradles or in the arms of their dead mothers. Altogether there perished in this cavern more than 3,000 Vaudois, including the entire population of the Val Lois. Cataneo distributed the property of these unfortunates among the vagabonds who accompanied him, and never again did the Vaudois church raise its head in these blood-stained valleys. The terrible stroke that fell on the Vale of Lois was the shielding of the neighboring valleys of Argentière and Freycinet. Their inhabitants had been destined to destruction also, but the fate of their co-religionists taught them that their only chance of safety lay in resistance. Accordingly, barricading the passes of their valleys, they showed such a front to the foe when he advanced that he deemed it prudent to turn away and leave them in peace. This devastating tempest now swept along to discharge its violence on other valleys. One would have thought, to use the words of Muston, that the plague had passed along the track over which its march lay. It was only the Inquisitors. A detachment of the French army struck across the Alps in a southeast direction, holding their course toward the Waldensian valleys, there to unite with the main body of the Crusaders under Cataneo. They slaughtered, pillaged, and burned as they went onward, and at last arrived with dripping swords in the valley of Pregelis. The valley of Pregelis, where we now see these assassins, sweeps along from almost the summit of the Alps to the south, watered by the rivers of Clusone and Dora, and opens on the great plain of Piedmont, having a Pinarello on the one side and Susa on the others. It was then and long after under the dominion of France. Quote, "Prior to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes," says Muston, "the Vaudois of these valleys, that is, Pregelis, and the lateral vales branching from it, possessed 11 parishes, 18 churches, and 64 centers of religious assembling, where worship was celebrated morning and evening as in as many hamlets. It was in Los, in Pregelis, that was held the famous synod where, 200 years before the Protestant Reformation, 140 Protestant pastors assembled, each accompanied by 2 or 3 lay deputies, and it was from the Val de Pregelis that the gospel of God made its way into France prior to the 15th century. This was the valley of Pregelis, which had been the scene of the terrible tragedy of Christmas, 1400. Again terror, mourning, and death were carried into it. The peaceful inhabitants who were expecting no such invasion were busy reaping their harvests when this horde of assassins burst upon them. In the first panic, they abandoned their dwellings and fled. Many were overtaken and slain. Hamlets and whole villages were given to the flames, nor could the caves in which multitudes sought refuge afford any protection. The horrible barbarity of the Val Lois was repeated in the valley of Pregelis. Combustible materials were piled up and fires kindled at the mouths of these hiding places, and when extinguished all was silent within. Folded together in one motionless heap lay mother and babe, patriarch and stripling, while the fatal smoke, which had cast them into that deep sleep, was eddying along the roof and slowly making its exit into the clear, sunlit summer sky. But the course of this destruction was stayed. After the first surprise the inhabitants took heart, and turning upon their murderers, drove them from their valley, exacting a heavy penalty in the pursuit for the ravages they had committed in it. We now turn to the Piedmontese portion of this army. It was led by the papal legate Cataneo in person. It was destined to operate against those valleys in Piedmont which were the most ancient seat of these religionists, and were deemed the stronghold of the Vaudois heresy. Cataneo repaired to Pinarillo, which adjoins the frontier of the doomed territory. Thence he dispatched a band of preaching monks to convert the men of the valleys. These missionaries returned without having, so far as appears, made a single convert. The legate now put his soldiers in motion. Traversing the glorious plain, the Clusone, gleaming out through such rich cornfields and vineyards on their left, and the mighty rampart of the hills with the chestnut forests, their pasturages and snows, rising grandly on their right, and turning round the shoulder of the corpse-clad Bichirasio, this army, with another army of pillagers and cutthroats in its rear, advanced up the long avenue that leads to La Tour, the capital of the valleys, and sat down before it. They had come against a simple, unarmed people, who knew how to tend their vines and lead their herds to pasture, and were ignorant of the art of war. It seemed as if the last hour of the Waldensian race had struck. Seeing this mighty host before their valleys, the Waldensians sent 2 of their patriarchs to request an interview with Cataneo, and turn, if possible, his heart to peace. John Campo and John Desiderio were dispatched on this embassy. "Do not condemn us without hearing us," said they, "for we are Christians and faithful subjects, and our barbs are prepared to prove, in public or in private, that our doctrines are conformable to the word of God. Our hope in God is greater than our desire to please men. Beware how you draw down upon yourselves his anger by persecuting us. For remember that if God so wills it, all the forces you have assembled against us will nothing avail." These were weighty words, and they were meekly spoken. But as to changing Cataneo's purpose or softening the hearts of the ruffian host which he led, they might as well have been addressed to the rocks which rose around the speakers. Nevertheless, they fell not to the ground. Cataneo, believing that the Vaudois herdsman would not stand an hour before his men at arms, and desirous of striking a finishing blow, divided his army into a number of attacking parties, which were to begin the battle on various points at the same time. The folly of extending his line so as to embrace the whole territory led to Cataneo's destruction, but his strategy was rewarded with a few small successes at first. One troop was stationed at the entrance of the Val Lucerna. We shall follow its march till it disappears on the mountains which it hopes to conquer, and then we shall return and narrate the more decisive operations of the campaign under Cataneo in the Val Grosgna. The first step of the invaders was to occupy the town of La Tour, situated on the angle formed by the junction, and he goes through some geography. The soldiers were probably spared the necessity or denied the pleasure of slaughter, the inhabitants having fled to the mountains. The valley beyond La Tour is too open to admit of being defended, and the troops advancing along it unopposed. Than this theatre of war, nothing in ordinary times is more peaceful, nothing more grand. A carpet of rich meadows clothes it from side to side. Fruitful trees fleck it with their shadows. The police waters it, and on either hand is a wall of mountains, whose sides display successive zones of festooned vines, golden grain, dark chestnut forests, and rich pasturages. More geography. Pursuing their march up the valley, the soldiers next came to Villaro. The troop had little difficulty in taking possession. Most of the inhabitants, warned of the approach of danger, had fled to the Alps. What Cataneo's troops inflicted on those who had been unable to make their escape, no history records. The half of Lucerna, with the towns of La Tour and Villaro and their hamlets, was in the occupation of Cataneo's soldiers. Their march so far had been a victorious one. though certainly not a glorious one, such victories as they had gained being only over unarmed peasants and bed-rid women. Resuming their march, the troops came to Bobbio, Bobbio. The name of Bobbio is not unknown in classic story. It nestles at the base of gigantic cliffs where the lofty summit of Col la Croix points the way to France, and overhangs a path which apostolic feet may have trodden. The police, Pellice, is seen forcing its way through the dark gorges of the mountains in a thundering torrent, and meandering in a flood of silver along the valley. The capture of Bobbio, an easy task, put the soldiers in possession of the entire valley of Lucerna. Its inhabitants had been chased to the Alps, or their blood mingled with the waters of their own Pellice. Other and remoter expeditions were now projected. Their plan was to traverse the Col Julien, sweep down on the valley of Prely, which lies on the north of it, chastise its inhabitants, pass on to the valleys of San Martino and Perosa, and pursuing the circuit of the valleys, and clearing the ground as they went onward of its inveterate heresy, at least of its heretics, join the main body of crusaders who, they expected, this time have finished their work in the valley of Angrogna, and altogether celebrated their victory. They would then be able to say that they had gone the round of the Waldensian territory, and had at last effected the long meditated work, so often attempted, but hitherto in vain, of the utter extirpation of its heresy. But the war was destined to have a very different termination. The expedition across the Col Julien was immediately commenced. A corps of 700 men was detached from the army in Lucerna for this service. The ascent of the mountain opens immediately on the north side of Bobbio. We see the soldiers toiling upward on the track, which is a mere footpath formed by the herdsmen. At every short distance they pass the thick-planted chalets and hamlets, sweetly embowered amid mantling vines, or the branches of the apple and cherry tree, or the goodlier chestnut, but the inhabitants have fled. They have now reached a great height on the mountainside. Beneath is Bobbio, a speck of brown. There is the valley of Lucerna, a ribbon of green, with a thread of silver woven into it, and lying along amid masses of mighty rocks. There, across Lucerna, are the great mountains that enclose the valley of Rora, standing up in the silent sky. On the right are the spiky crags that bristle along the pass of Mirabeau that leads to France, and yonder in the east is a glimpse of the far-extending plains of Piedmont. But the summit is yet a long way off, and the soldiers of the papal legate, bearing their weapons, to be employed not in venturesome battle, but in cowardly massacre, toil up the ascent. As they gain on the mountain, they look down on pinnacles which half an hour before had looked down on them. Other heights, tall as the former, still rise above them. They climb to these airy spires, which in their turn sink beneath their feet. Process they repeat again and again, and at last they come out upon the downs that clothe the shoulders of the mountain. Now it is that the scene around them becomes one of stupendous and inexpressible grandeur. Away to the east, now fully under the eye, is the plain of Piedmont, green as a meadow and level as ocean. At their feet yawns gorges and abysses, while spiky pinnacles peer up from below, as if to buttress the mountain. More geography. Suddenly on the mountains above had gathered this flock of vultures that with greedy eyes were looking down upon their prey. Impatient to begin their work, the 700 assassins rushed down on the plain. The troop had reckoned that, no tidings of their approach having reached this secluded valley, they would fall upon its unarmed peasants as falls the avalanche, and crush them. But it was not to be so. Instead of fleeing, panic-stricken, as the invaders expected, the men of Prely hastily assembled and stood to their defense. Battle was joined at the hamlet of Pommiers. The weapons of the Vaudois were rude, but their trust in God and their indignation at the cowardly and bloody assault gave them strength and courage. The Piedmontese soldiers, wearied with the rugged, slippery tracks they had traversed, fell beneath the blows of their opponents. Every man of them was cut down with the exception of one ensign. Of all the 700, he alone survived. During the carnage he made his escape, and ascending the banks of a mountain torrent, he crept into a cavity which the summer heats had formed in a mass of snow. There he remained hid for some days. At last, cold and hunger drove him forth to cast himself upon the mercy of the men of Prely. They were generous enough to pardon this solitary survivor of the host that had come to massacre them. They sent him back across the Col Julien to tell those from whom he had come that the Vaudois had courage to fight for their hearths and altars, and that of the army of 700 which they had sent to slay them, he only had escaped to carry tidings of the fate which had befallen his companions. Chapter 5. Failure of Cataneo's expedition. The camp of Cataneo was pitched almost at the gates of La Tour, beneath the shadow of Castelluzzo. The papal legate was about to try to force his way into the Val di Angrogna. This valley opens hard by the spot where the legate had established his camp, and on for a dozen miles into the Alps, a magnificent succession of narrow gorges and open dells, walled throughout by majestic mountains and terminating in a noble circular basin, the Pra del Tor, which is set round with snowy peaks and forms the most venerated spot in all the Waldensian territory, inasmuch as it was the seat of their college and the meeting place of their barbs. In the Pra del Tor, or meadow of the Tower, Cataneo expected to surprise the mass of the Waldensian people, now gathered into it as being the strongest refuge which their hills afforded. There too he expected to be joined by the corps which he had sent round by Lucerna to make the circuit of the valleys, and after devastating Preli and San Martino, to climb the mountain barrier and join their companions in the Pra. Little imagining that the soldiers he had dispatched on the errand of massacre were now enriching with their corpses the valleys they had been sent to subdue. In that same spot where the barbs had so often met in synod, and enacted rules for the government of their church and the spread of their faith, the papal legate would reunite his victorious host, and finish the campaign by proclaiming that now the Waldensian heresy, root and branch, was extinct. The Waldenses, their humble supplication for peace having been contemptuously rejected, as we have already said, had three courses in their choice: to go to mass, to be butchered as sheep, or to fight for their lives. They chose the last, and made ready for battle. But first they must remove to a place of safety all who were unable to bear arms. Packing up their kneading troughs, their ovens, and their culinary utensils, laying their aged on their shoulders, and the sick in their couches, and leading their children by the hand, they began to climb the hills, in the direction of the Pra del Tor, at the head of the Val di Angrogna. Transporting their household stuff, they could be seen traversing the rugged paths, and making the mountains resound with psalms, which they sweetly sang as they journeyed up the ascent. Those who remained busied themselves in manufacturing pikes and other weapons of defense and attack, in repairing the barricades, in arranging themselves into fighting parties, and assigning to the various corps the posts they were to defend. Cataneo now put his soldiers in motion. Advancing to near the town of La Tour, they made a sharp turn to the right and entered the Val di Angrogna. Its opening offers no obstruction, being soft even as any meadow in all England. By and by it begins to swell into the heights of some word I can't pronounce, where the Vaudois had resolved to make a stand. Their fighting men were posted along its ridge. Their army was of the simplest. The bow was almost their only weapon of attack. They wore bucklers of skin, covered with the bark of the chestnut tree, the better to resist thrust of pike or cut of sword. In the hollow behind, protected by the rising ground on which their fathers, husbands, and brothers were posted, were a number of women and children gathered there for shelter. The Piedmontese host pressed up the acclivity, discharging a shower of arrows as they advanced, and the Waldensian line on which these missiles fell seemed to waver and to be on the point of giving way. Those behind, espying the danger, fell on their knees, and extending their hands in supplication to the God of battles, cried aloud, "O God of our fathers, help us! O God, deliver us!" That cry was heard by the attacking host, and especially by one of its captains, Le Noir of Mondovi, or the Black Mondovi, a proud, bigoted, bloodthirsty man. He instantly shouted out that his soldiers would give the answers, accompanying his threat with horrible blasphemies. The Black Mondovi raised his visor as he spoke. At the instant an arrow from the bow of Pierre Revel, of Angrogna entered between his eyes, transfixed his skull, and he fell on the earth a corpse. The fall of this daring leader disheartened the papal army. The soldiers began to fall back. They were chased down the slopes by the Vaudois, who now descended upon them like one of their own mountain torrents. Having driven their invaders to the plain, cutting off not a few in their flight, they returned as the evening began to fall, to celebrate with songs, on the heights where they had won it, the victory with which it had pleased the God of their fathers to crown their arms. Cataneo burned with rage and shame at being defeated by these herdsmen. In a few days, reassembling his host, he made a second attempt to enter the Angrogna. This promised to be successful. He passed the height of Rocomeni, that place I can't pronounce, where he had encountered his first defeat, without meeting any resistance. He led his soldiers into the narrow defiles beyond. Here great rocks overhang the path. Mighty chestnut trees fling their branches across the way, veiling it in gloom, and far down thunders the torrent that waters the valley. Still advancing, he found himself, without fighting, in possession of the ample and fruitful expanse into which these defiles passed. The valley opens. He was now master so far of the Val d'Angrogna, comprehending the numerous hamlets, with their finely cultivated fields and vineyards, and on the left of the torrent. But he had seen none of the inhabitants. These, he knew, were with the men of Lucerna in Pradaltor. Between him and his prey rose the Barricade, a steep, unscalable mountain, which runs like a wall across the valley and forms a rampart to the famous meadow, which combines the solemnity of sanctuary with the strength of citadel. Must the advance of the papal legate and his army here end? It seemed as if it must. Cataneo was in a vast cul-de-sac. He could see the white peaks round the Pra, but between him and the Pra itself rose, in cyclopean strength and height, the Barricade. He searched, and unhappily for himself, found an entrance. Some convulsion of nature had here rent the mountains, and through the long, narrow, and dark chasm thus formed lies the one only path that leads to the head of Angrogna. The leader of the papal host boldly ordered his men to enter and traverse this frightful gorge, not knowing how few of them he should ever lead back. The only pathway through this chasm is a rocky ledge on the side of the mountain, so narrow that not more than two abreast can advance along it. If assailed either in front or in rear, or from above, there is absolutely no retreat. Nor is there room for the party attacked to fight. The pathway is hung midway between the bottom of the gorge, along which rolls the stream, and the summit of the mountain. Here the naked cliff runs sheer up for at least 1,000 feet. There it leans over the path in stupendous masses, which look as if about to fall. Here lateral fissures admit the golden beams of the sun, which relieve the darkness of the pass, and make it visible. There a half-acre or so of level space gives standing room on the mountain's side to a clump of birches, with their tall silvery trunks, or a chalet, with its bit of bright, close-shaven meadow. But these only partially relieve the terrors of the chasm, which runs on from 1 to 2 miles, when, with a burst of light, and a sudden flashing of white peaks on the eye, it opens into an amphitheater of meadow and dimensions so goodly that an entire nation might find room to encamp in it. It was into this terrible defile that the soldiers of the papal legate now marched. They kept advancing as best they could along the narrow ledge. They were now nearing the Pra. It seemed impossible for their prey to escape them. Assembled on this spot, the Waldensian people had but one neck, and the papal soldiers, as Cataneo believed, were to sever that neck at a blow. But God was watching over the Vaudois. He had said of the papal legate and his army, as of another tyrant of former days, "I will put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will cause thee to return by the way of which thou camest." But by what agency was the advance of that host to be stayed? Will some mighty angel smite Cataneo's army, as he did Sennacherib's? No angel blockaded the pass. Will thunderbolts and hailstones be raised upon Capaneo's soldiers, as of old on Sisera's? The thunders slept, the hail fell not. Will earthquake and whirlwind discomfit them? No earthquake rocked the ground, no whirlwind rent the mountains. The instrumentality now put in motion to shield the Vaudois from destruction was one of the lightest and frailest in all nature, yet no bars of adamant could have more effectually shut the pass, and brought the march of the host to an instant halt. A white cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, unobserved by the Piedmontese, but keenly watched by the Vaudois, was seen to gather on the mountain's summit, about the time the army would be entering the defile. That cloud grew rapidly bigger and blacker. It began to descend. It came rolling down the mountain's side, wave on wave, like an ocean tumbling out of heaven, a sea of murky vapor. It fell right into the chasm in which the papal army, sealing it up, and filling it from top to bottom with a thick black fog. In a moment the host were in night. They were bewildered, stupefied, and could see neither before nor behind, could neither advance nor retreat. They halted in a state bordering on terror. The Waldenses interpreted this as an interposition of Providence in their behalf. It had given them the power of repelling the invader. Climbing the slopes of the Pra and issuing from all their hiding places in its environs, they spread themselves over the mountains, the paths of which were familiar to them, and while the host stood riveted beneath them, caught in the double toils of the defile and the mist, they tore up huge rocks and stones and sent them thundering down into the ravine. The papal soldiers were crushed where they stood. Nor was this all. Some of the Waldenses boldly entered the chasm, sword in hand, and attacked them in front. Consternation seized the Piedmontese host. Panic impelled them to flee, but their effort to escape was more fatal than the sword of the Vaudois, or the rocks that swift as arrow came hounding down the mountain. They jostled one another, they threw each other down in the struggle. Some were trodden to death, others were rolled over the precipice and crushed on the rocks below, or drowned in the torrent, and so perished miserably. The fate of one of these invaders has been preserved in story. He was a certain Captain Sacquet, a man, it is said, of gigantic stature, from Polonera in Piedmont. He began, like his Philistine prototype, to vent curses on the Waldensian dogs. The words were not yet in his mouth when his foot slipped. Rolling over the precipice and tumbling into the torrent of the Angrojna, he was carried away by the stream, and his body finally deposited in a deep eddy or whirlpool, called in the patois of the country a tempête, from the noise made by its waters. It bears to this day the name of the Tempête of Saquet, or Gulf of Saquet. This war hung above the valleys, like a cloud of tempest, for a whole year. It inflicted much suffering and loss upon the Waldenses. Their homes were burned, their fields devastated, their goods carried off, and their persons slain. But the invaders suffered heavier losses than they inflicted. Of the 18,000 regular troops, to which we may add about an equal number of desperadoes, with which the campaign opened, few ever returned to their homes. They left their bones on the mountains they had come to subdue. They were cut off mostly in detail. They were led weary chases, from valley to mountain and from mountain to valley. The rocks rolled upon them, gave them at once death and burial. They were met in narrow defiles and cut to pieces. Flying parties of Waldenses would suddenly issue from the mist, or from some cave known only to themselves, attack and discomfit the foe, and then as suddenly retreat into the friendly vapor or the sheltering rock. Thus it came to pass that, in the words of Muston, this army of invaders vanished from the Vaudois mountains as rain in the sands of the desert. God, says Laguerre, turned the heart of their prince toward this poor people. He sent a prelate to their valleys to assure them of his goodwill and to intimate his wish to receive their deputies. They sent 12 of their most venerable men to Turin, who, being admitted into the Duke's presence, gave him such an account of their faith that he candidly confessed that he had been misled in what he had done against them, and would not again suffer such wrongs to be inflicted upon them. He several times said that he, quote, had not so virtuous, so faithful, and so obedient subjects as the Vaudois. He caused the deputies a little surprise by expressing a wish to see some of the Vaudois children. 12 infants, with their mothers, were straightway sent for from the valley of Angrogna and presented before the prince. He examined them narrowly. He found them well formed, and testified his admiration of their healthy faces, clear eyes, and lively prattle. He had been told, he said, that, quote, the Vaudois children were monsters, with only one eye placed in the middle of the forehead, 4 rows of black teeth, and other similar deformities. The prince, Charles II., a youth of only 20 years, but humane and wise, confirmed the privileges and immunities of the Vaudois, and dismissed them with his promise that they should be unmolested in the future. The churches of the valleys now enjoyed a short respite from persecution.